So my presentation is entitled Comparative Methods for Determining Ancestry in Unidentified Human Skeletal Remains, which is very long and convoluted, and I'll explain exactly what that means. But first, I'd like to start off by thanking essentially everyone in this room, because you're all rock stars and you've all helped me so much. Professor McAlpin, brainstorming sessions all day. Dr. Cynthia Wagner for being my host in the lab and my brain, essentially. Dr. Stephen Freeland. This semester has been awesome. Thank you for all of your help. And of course, Director Emeritus Patricia Lanou, the matriarch of all of us. So, I'd like to start by having you all imagine that you're in a courtroom and a murder has taken place. And as a member of the jury, you have to decide which facts you believe to be true. In this case, the body of the victim in question is badly decomposed and fragmented, requiring the assistance of a forensic anthropologist to determine identity. Now, while listening to the defendant's lawyer question the expert witness, he points out that the victim's identity was determined using ill-supported methods based upon racial typologies that are older than you are, that are older than your parents. Now, keep in mind that the punishment for manslaughter in the state of Maryland is 25 years to life in prison without parole. How would you feel about this as a member of the jury? Would you be comfortable charging someone with a crime when something as fundamental as the identity of the victim were in question? My guess is no. So I'd like to start off with a quote from forensic anthropologist Norman Sauer that states, "If races don't exist, why are forensic anthropologists so good at identifying them?" And in the course of this talk, I'll argue that the problem addressed in this question lies in the clarification of the concept of race and the subsequent standardization of methods to determine race. So first I'll begin with the concept of race, which is an uncomfortable term for everyone. But why? So from a scientific perspective, race is fundamentally problematic. We know from the biological species concept that species categorization is not assembled according to similarity in appearance. And race is a categorization at a subspecies level, which means that as a concept, it operates within these parameters, and thus it cannot be based upon similarity in appearance, but we know that it is. So then, does race exist only as a social construct? Some critics would argue yes, saying that because biological races don't exist, estimating race from phenotypic traits such as craniofacial traits, what you see when you look at someone, is not useful at all and reverts back to 19th century typology and reinforces racial stereotypes. So then I'll ask again, if races don't exist, why are forensic anthropologists so good at identifying them? I'll answer this by looking at how different disciplines determine race. So first, anthropology. They determine race using non-metric trait analysis. So using this methodology, they look at discrete characteristics, primarily the craniofacial skeleton, and then they're observed and scored and interpreted based upon pre-existing statistical data. So here we can see some commonly used non-metric traits circled in red on various aspects of the same cranium. And then biology determines race in a various number of ways, but one way that they do is by using single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are referred to as SNPs. SNPs are single letter changes in DNA base pairs. So they can be used as ancestry informative markers if they're detected in at least 1% of the population. So here in this picture we can see an example of a single nucleotide polymorphism. There's a change from the G to the A in these two differing alleles, and these would be the characteristics of different populations. So then what's the problem? Why are these methods not good enough on their own to determine racial identity, if there is such a thing as racial identity? I argue that the first problem is one of clarification. Race is denoted from ancestry, which is a continuous concept, not a categorical one, as it is often perceived through an anthropological lens. The second problem is of standardization. Non-metric trait and single nucleotide polymorphism analysis alone are not sufficient means to determine ancestry in unidentified remains. For non-metric trait theory, it's largely based on 19th century typological systems of racial stereotyping and is often criticized for having a high degree of inter-observer error. And single nucleotide polymorphisms are not always going to be available. There could be the simple fact that we can't get DNA in the case of a fire where the DNA has denatured. Also, there may not be an associated SNP for that particular population, or we may not be able to locate it or amplify it, in which case we wouldn't get any data even after all that work. So it would seem to me that the most logical thing to do in this situation is to reduce inter-observer error. We have to standardize the procedure in which these traits are quantified using both methods from anthropology and biology. And to do this, we have to use an interdisciplinary methodology. Thank you, Repco. So using Repco's technique of redefinition, we can give race a more fine-tuned meaning. So sociology defines race as a continuous social construct, which inherently strips it of any chance of being applicable, of being used in a scientific way. In contrast, biology and anthropology use race as a structural term for categorizing and classifying. I argue that if the term race is going to continue to be used in this context, as it is, even though everyone cringes when they hear it, it needs to be redefined to suit its purpose as a signifier of a continuous blend of traits that can be used to infer ancestry. So then, Repco's interdisciplinary technique of theory expansion is where the practicality of the interdisciplinary methodology will come into play. So there must be an expansion of non-metric trait theory here to address causation. So what causes these phenotypic traits to be present on the craniofacial skeleton? And we know now from 21st century science that it's caused by your genotype, by your genome, what codes for these things. And sometimes it's single nucleotide polymorphisms, if they are coding, which we know that 90% of the genome is non-coding, or 99%. So by expanding non-metric trait theory to include biological causation factors, identification becomes less categorical and increasingly accurate. So I'll talk a little bit about the research now. So Dr. Wagner of the biology department and I continue to search for SNPs that we can use as ancestry informative markers for case studies. The intention is to use these SNPs associated with certain regions and compare them to non-metric traits identifiable on human remains, primarily on the craniofacial skeleton, as I said earlier, to determine the accuracy of those phenotypic traits using the genome. So this hopefully will standardize the methodology for determining ancestry and shed race and the methods we use of its typological origins and hopefully reduce inter-observer error. So here we can see the process of this standardization happening, or the beginning of it. We're collecting DNA samples from people from various ethnic backgrounds and analyzing them with specific primers in the lab, and then we're using simple polymerase chain reaction and gel electrophoresis. Simultaneously, we'll be comparing this data that we get with this genetic polymorphism data to characteristics of the craniofacial skeleton, the non-metric traits that we're seeing used in anthropology. And this hopefully will standardize the methodology and effectively eliminate racial bias. And then we can determine the race of or the identity rather, of the victim in question. Any questions for me?
I will go with scribbles first.
Okay.
Okay, I think I understood maybe 25%.
Oh, no, really?
No, you did a great job. I'm just saying it's a complex, it's scientific.
It is,
complex.
it's hard.
So understand that my question is, there's some ignorance. I'm sure that's going to get reflected in it. But I just wanted to know what you mean by ancestry in this context. I'm thinking you mean like a sort of geographical origin.
That's exactly what I mean.
Okay.
And I should have specified and said geographical origin when I was talking about ancestry. So with the DNA that we're sequencing, we have found people that are just one generation of being from a specific geographic location, and that their grandparents and their grandparents have been there. So we're trying to establish a database that is essentially one that we can use as a reference point. So then when we are looking for mixed populations, which is now the case, we can find them. And that might mean later on not using single nucleotide polymorphisms, but maybe using insertion deletions or indels, which are better for admixture.
Yeah. Just sort of a follow-up from that thing I was thinking. I for many reasons, want to feel there's value in pushing back on the concept of race.
Absolutely.
Race. And I guess I'm wondering if I see here maybe a social need to find ways to educate us to complexify our understanding of ancestry and
Right,
when we're
and
thinking
I
about identifying.
knew that this was going to be, well, that's the reason I did it, right? Was I was listening to forensic anthropologists in my internships, listening to them talk and say the word race over and over and over again. And I had this barrier up, and I was like, you can't do that. Like but in a forensic context, in a court of law, it's used so much, and I'm sure you know that. So it was kind of like, I could see where there would be people on the jury that would hear this from an expert witness, and the credibility would just be eliminated, because that's how they identified the victim. They found his race, and then what is race? Especially if you come from the social sciences, that the natural tendency is just to push away all of that. Which is why I say that we really do need to redefine the term if we are going to continue to use it, because in my papers I lean towards saying ancestry or geographic origin. But if it's going to be used, which it is, then it needs to be redefined in a way that's that you can grasp onto, that sheds some of those negative connotations, and is a little bit, I don't know, more defined,
Okay. So, you've led very nicely into what I wanted to ask, which is I feel hovering around the edge of everything you said is a linguistic dimension.
Exactly, yeah.
You even used the word signify once.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that you delved into at all? Do you feel that language is a significant part of the solution you're reaching for?
Absolutely. I don't talk a whole lot about that, but it really is a central issue. I talk a little bit more about, obviously, the connotation that science, and rather 19th century science, has given to this term, especially in this context, because most of these methods that we developed were developed in the 1940s, and when you think about that, it's not helpful. So really, it does need to be a little bit of a language education talk that needs to happen. If we are going to continue to use this in any context, it needs to be redefined, and not just in a room with anthropologists. It needs to be published and talked about.
I guess the question I kept coming back to is, why is race useful in the judicial system?
Okay.
So, because then you sort of, this is a science sort of society question.
Mm-hmm.
What are you trying to, as from the question to ask the scientists working on this, and so what problem are you trying to address? Well, the problem you're trying to address has to obviously be connected to how race is used in the court system. So if the idea is you want to be able to give is it simply for identification purposes of someone who is completely unidentified, and this will help you figure out who the person is? Because does it matter what the race of the person is, however that's defined, and for most people?
So there's like three parts to that question. So it starts off with saying that when a forensic anthropologist is given a case, a set of remains, they have to establish a biological profile. And all of these, it's age, any pathologies, sex, and the most helpful often is their race or their ancestry, because all of these things are put into a database of missing persons. And if you can narrow down the categories, you can find a match. But then this also goes into a conversation of research. So what I want to do here, essentially, if I, in the future, get the resources to do so, I'd like to establish a database that compares non-metric traits and what we're seeing to single nucleotide polymorphisms to essentially determine if they're correct or incorrect, if they are useful or they're not useful. So then we'll have this database of statistical data, and we can input it and say, okay, this is a useful non-metric trait. We see this in this population in combination with these different things. And then when we're doing research and we find remains, it could tell us about evolutionary pathways. If we find someone in, with characteristics that are African at this specific time, and we find them up in Europe, we know that they managed to migrate there somehow before anybody else, or depending on the time frame that we find them in. I mean, this could tell us a lot if it's standardized.
But that's, I'm sorry, just a quick follow-up. That's different than the forensic
Right.
issue. But hold on. So if there's a missing person,
Mhm.
how does that necessarily help you in this instance, unless you have some genetic evidence or you can compare what you have from the remains from what the person.
So we would use the database that had been already created using existing living people and skeletal markers. We would use that or take them from the same skeletons and then establish a database. And then from there, we could determine if these traits are significant and if they're true. And then you can take that and use those traits to determine the identity of someone that's missing. So we wouldn't be doing single nucleotide polymorphism analysis on these unidentified remains because we wouldn't be able to find the primers for them, right? Because so it would be from, how do I explain this? We would be pulling information out of this database to use on unidentified human remains. And then we could also use that with ancient remains and paleopathology and determining how diseases migrated and how people migrated and hopefully, maybe, yeah?
I think that last bit about paleopathology might partly have answered this, but for $99 and a cheek swab, I can send off to a company like 23andMe and they will tell me what my geographic ancestry is based on SNPs that already exist.
Right.
So is that data not available? Why are those not sufficient?
So part of it is that data is not available. 23andMe, actually I have contacted them and talked with them and they're not data sharing. So if we're going to use this in an educational way where we can establish a database for people to use it, they need to be published. And some of them are. Yale's Kid Lab published their SNPs and you can find them online and that's actually how we found the ones that we're looking for. But it's various SNPs that are found in certain percentages and it's there's still a lot more work to be done.
So you can figure out geographic ancestry with SNPs that aren't linked to traits. So
right.
So are you trying to link SNPs to traits to somehow try to come down against the concept of race?
Not necessarily.
I'm wondering why you need to link them to traits.
To traits?
Yeah.
Okay, so alone, non-metric traits, they're used every day.
Right.
But they are still criticized for being not so accurate at all. And the inter-observer error rate is so high. And that's not a problem that's being addressed. The way that it's being addressed is within anthropology. They're just trying to find more traits and see if they can correlate these traits. But I argue that the problem is that we're not looking at the causation of these traits. And maybe not directly they're not caused by genotype, but if we can somehow link them to genotype using SNPs, saying, we know from this SNP that this person is from this population, from this geographical area. And then we can look at their non-metric traits and say, and we're getting different data here. So obviously we're doing something wrong, and then we can adjust and figure out where we're wrong and which traits we're looking at are helpful and which are not.
But how do you do that
I
when you have a
apologize, we're going to have to
continuum?
encourage you that all of our presenters are, of course, really in existence, even when they're not standing by a podium and the world can email.
You can absolutely email me. Maybe you'll ask me questions that'll make me think.
But for the sake of our next speaker, Albert Marshall, who has a good clean minute to get ready.
Sorry,
about that,
I'm
but
sorry.
We'll just say thank you very
Running
much,
away.
Rachelle.